Okay, start of a little mini series of tutorials, I imagine, about rigging in Cinema 4D. I'm teaching a 3D motion class this semester. And any discussion of rigging, you have to start with the idea or the discussion of the transform, right? The pivot, whether it's an object or a null or a bone or something like that. It's the control point, if you want to think of it that way, this pivot point for an object in relationship to other objects. So if I were to create a null object, right, I have just a point in space, right, that I can move around. So there's no geometry there, but it's, if I move it or rotate it, it's from this orientation, right, from this tiny little spot right there. All right, so let's look at this in the context of some geometry. All right, so I have a cube, right, and so the example I'm going to use here in a second, in fact, instead of a cube, my apologies, let's do a cylinder. I think that's what the student was using in class. So what if I want to create like a little appendage, an arm, a tentacle, that kind of thing, and I want to do this with some cylinders, right now I have this as a primitive object. So right, it's parametric. I can make changes to it. The one thing I can't do it while it's in this current state is move the pivot point. So up here is the axis tool, right? Enable axis modification. And if I click on this and I go to the move, oops, I grabbed a little handle there. It still just moves the object. And really what I want to do is move this pivot. It's important to remember that this object is basically two objects. It's two main things. It's a transform, right? It's some coordinates. And then it's an object, right? It has the properties to describe its cylinderness. Never thought I would say that word when I started my day. But this is the cylinderness of this object. And these are the coordinates, right? These are the transform that make that up. So it's kind of two things all combined into one object. So if I want to modify the pivot so that it's maybe at the bottom, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this object with a height of 200, and I'm going to go to the coordinates and move it up 100, right? So it's sitting flat on the ground. And if I hit the C or make edit command, right? I could right click. Well, there it is, right? Make editable, right? And then I can move, if I have this, the enable axis modification on. And so I can move this down. In fact, I'll move it down just 100 centimeters. I'll turn this, and this is important, I'll turn this back off so that at this point, if I move the object, it moves. And most importantly, if I rotate, it's going to rotate from this base, right? Let's imagine, I'll hide this thing. Let's imagine that it's important for whatever reason that I keep this cylinder parametric, right? So that I can change the rotations, right? The rotation segments, right? So maybe I need to be able to change this dynamically in my animation. And I don't want to do make edit, right? But I still need to have a pivot here. Well, I can still do that. So let's move the coordinates up 100, right? So it's still in that same position. And, if I want to, I could create a null, right? So here's a transform, right? That's at the bottom. And if I simply parent, let's drag this down here. So if I parent the cylinder to the null object, when I click on the null object, it now is rotating from the bottom. Well, the cylinder's not rotating, the parent is, the null object is, right? So I could use that for my animation so that I could keep this parametric. And I'm going to do that, I think, actually, just to make my point. Let's make this a little, just back to 16 again. And there we go. So I'll just leave it like that, but it's it's nice because it's still parametric. I could add some bevels to this in there. So at time of render, right, I can increase the quality of that. So that's great. And I have this null object that's down here at the bottom. The null object, it doesn't have a surface that I can click on, but I can, underneath the object properties for the null, tell it how to represent that point in space with some kind of icon. I could make it a sphere, right, so that it's selectable. Now this isn't going to render, right? It's just a GUI interface thing, right? So I'll just make it a cube, and I'll scale this down, right? This is just for the purposes of selecting, right? So if I click on this, it now selects that object, so I can rotate it. So let's go ahead and I'm going to hold down the command key so that I duplicate, right? So this is null number 1, and there's number 2. So I'm going to take number 1, and I'm going to drag it up. And let's use the scale, right? Just make it a little bit smaller. Let's do the same thing with this one. Okay, so I have these little components together. Now I just need to parent them. So there's this one. Really what I'm thinking of, what this would look like. In fact, let's do it this way. 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to delete that one. So the example here would be one parent, and then this would be a child, and this would be a child. Well, these have a child below them, and there's several ways you can parent this up, but this is the first one right here at the bottom, this is the second one, and this is the third one. So I'll just take this one and make it a child of that. So you can see the child of this null is this one, and the child of this null is here, right? And then this one that's null number 2, I'll make that a child of number 1. So you can see I get 1, 2, 3, just like I had 3, 4, 5, right? From a parenting standpoint. And it just so happens that this is parented to this one is parented to that one, this one is parented to that one, right? And if I hold down the command key, so I can multiple select, right? Null and null 1 and null 2. I go to the coordinates and looky here, right? I can scrub through here. Right, and so I could animate that if I need to. But the main point is I've positioned these pivots, these transforms, right, at the intersection, right, at the knuckle, if you want to think of this as in essence like a finger, and then I've attached this geometry to it. And this is important because, maybe you build a really, really complex grouping of objects, right? Because you're doing some mechanical transformer, and then this null is actually the main controller, right, to do this. And later on in other tutorials, I'll start doing this with actually creating joints like a skeleton, and you can parent objects to it that way, or bind it, or lots of other things. So let's just recap. With the null, or with these objects, we have in fact, let me select all these. Let's go back again. Okay. So we can make an object editable and move its pivot to a location that satisfies our need for where it's going to rotate, right? Does it always have to be at the end? No, but that's what's needed in this case. Or I can parent things up a certain way, right, with other objects. I also, instead of doing it this way, I could have created a cylinder and positioned it at these points and then parented the null objects with it. So it's just important to get a sense of how this hierarchy is working, right? Again, this one, if I follow the line down to it, this is the child of that one. This is the child of this one. This is the child of this one. And then these are all parented up. I could also do it this way if I wanted to. And then put this one here and this one here. So it goes null cylinder, null cylinder, null cylinder. It's the same thing. It's just that this null is related to this cylinder now, which can create some little problems. It also makes it a little bit more difficult from a selection standpoint. I would not advise doing it this way, but you can visually see the hierarchy better that way, right? What I really care about is this hierarchy, because those are the things that are controlling it. The rest of the geometry is along for the ride, right? I could turn around and say, hey, let's add a cylinder here and move that up and let's just scale it. So for whatever reason I want to have this this object here, I'll just make that a child of this null, right? So now the cylinder and the sphere are part of this object for rotating, right? So it's part of that. All right, 10 minutes, 11 minutes. I will call that good, and I'll come back with some follow-up tutorials using some different methods. All right.